The Princess and the Scoundrel, written by Beth Revis, follows Han Solo and Leia Organa as they decide to marry each other following the Rebel Alliance's victory at the Battle of Endor, and are then persuaded to take time off and celebrate on the honeymoon aboard the Halcyon Starcruiser, where they are faced with the reality that the Empire hasn't immediately disappeared following the Emperor's death aboard the Death Star. I'm not going to lie when I say that I was skeptical coming into the book. I love Han and Leia, and the original trilogy is arguably my favorite era of Star Wars, but this just didn't seem like a story worth telling, and only a way to continue to promote the Halcyon Starcruiser experience. I think part of my minimal anticipation was letting the negative reactions online from when it was announced get to me, but it also doesn't help when the book is stuck between some of my most anticipated Star Wars stories of the year, with Padawan and Shadow of the Sith releasing in the previous months, and the next phase of High Republic stories coming out this fall. I could not have been more wrong. While it still had its weak aspects, the book exceeded all of my expectations. I did not expect everything about Han and Leia to be written so beautifully. Right away, I was hooked by the post-Battle of Endor state of the galaxy, getting to see how some things changed after the Emperor's death and some didn't. It also helped that the book begins on Endor with characters that we're already familiar with, like Han, Leia, Luke, Lando, and Mon Mothma. We've never seen much of Mon, so with Andor coming up soon, I was really glad that her character got fleshed out a little bit, even if it was just her relationship with Leia. Even though I mostly enjoyed the scenes between Luke and Leia, where they discuss Vader and the Force, it never sounded like Luke. From my experience, the character seems like a very hard character to write, with even Shadow of the Sith not getting it perfect. He was only in the very beginning of the book, but it still dampens scenes that I wished I could be loving. It was also hard to feel a lot of the stakes throughout the book, because we know both main characters live on for another 30 years. But once a new group of characters was introduced for us to care about, it starts to feel like there is actually something to lose here, or gain if the mission can be pulled off. A lot of the side characters, especially from later in the book, were solid, but I honestly don't think I could name a single one of them. They just weren't very memorable to me. The majority of the action sequences were written very well, and were good enough to keep me interested. And there were a few shocking scenes that made sense in the moment, but were rarely predictable, at least for me. There was also a major tone shift from the first to the second act of the novel, and I thought it was executed very well. The story begins as celebratory and united as the rebels ride the emotional high after Endor, but then Leia and Han go back into the galaxy where everything felt tense and cramped for the characters, and I could feel that as a reader too. I mentioned earlier how beautifully the book was written, and that carried on until the very last chapter. Listening to the audiobook, I loved the decision to mix the Han and Leia narrators at the end, and it led to a heartwarming ending that gave me chills. I didn't notice many of the sound effects from the audiobook, but both narrators were perfect fits for the character they embodied, and the choice of music fit well with every moment. One of the main things that I look for in Star Wars books, specifically, is characterization. I'm okay with a large galaxy-spanning story that impacts the canon in big ways, but I really enjoy the smaller stories that focus on the characters, that let us as the reader get inside their head and learn more about them as people. And that is exactly what I got from this book. Revis did an excellent job getting into the minds of Han and Leia, and their voices were exactly like how we see them in the original trilogy. Everything between the two of them felt absolutely perfect. Whether it be their squabbling or witty retorts, it felt like they had taken a step forward from where they were in the original trilogy now that they're married, but they're still the same people inside. There were a lot of reflection moments done by both of them throughout the book, whether it be on the war or their lives beforehand. It made me realize that a few weeks ago, Han had just come out of the carbonite where he had spent the last year. He had no idea what happened in between, and no one had had time to explain it all to him. Both Han and Leia have to deal with the knowledge that he missed a year of events, and it occurred right after Leia had told him she loved him. I never expected elaboration on it, but I was so glad we got it. Leia eventually told Han part of what he had missed, and how she had a run-in with Qi'ra. It made sense to tell him, and I'm glad the time wasn't spent giving Han a full rundown of what he had missed. Normally I wouldn't have minded that, but it would have broken up the pacing as well as the mood of the story, and it just wasn't that important for this novel. Qi'ra was also referenced a few times when Han thinks about his past, on Corellia when he and Qi'ra served under Lady Proxima, when he joined the Empire for a short time just to survive, even though he wasn't evil, and when he rescued Leia only hoping for a profit, and ended up getting so much more out of it. However, for a while, we were getting much more backstory about Leia, which I had no problem with. I loved getting to see Alderaan and its culture through her eyes, and it added much more weight to the planet's destruction, as well as the death of Bail and Breha Organa, her parents. I was also surprised at how much it hurt me when Mon Mothma mentioned how proud they would have been to see her get married. I thought that the proposal scene between Han and Leia was decent, but it did a good job of showing Leia's shock. It was odd seeing Leia show so many emotions at the start of the book, when I'm so used to her being the strong and courageous face of the rebellion, but it helped add more depth to an already well-known character. The entire marriage scene just filled me with positive feelings that I can't really explain. Seeing these two characters who have endured so much in their lifetimes finally get to relax and have fun without worrying about an incoming attack just felt nice to read about. Especially with the added music from the audiobook. The entire wedding scene was written beautifully from both points of view, and it really felt like both characters were there. The Ewok traditions were confusing to everyone, but it added that much more meaning to the wedding because you could tell how important it was to their culture, and they were passing it on to Han and Leia. The swapping point of views was something that I was hesitant about to begin with, but I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected. When the book began, it helped allow us to wrap up the revelations from Return of the Jedi without anything feeling forced. Han is still a general in the rebellion, and has to deal with the remaining Imperial forces, and Leia has to deal with the news that she is Luke's sister, Vader's daughter, and Force-sensitive. It creates a conflict between Luke and Leia, because Leia only knew Vader as her torturer aboard the Death Star, not the good man that Luke had seen before his death. Leia now has to deal with the future and what it brings. Luke wants to train his sister and have her join him on his quest across the galaxy to learn more about the Jedi. But after being proposed to by Han, she now has this completely separate life ahead of her. One where she serves the New Republic at its capital, with her entire family there. Han, Luke, her kids. She also wants to do as much good for the galaxy as she can before her parentage is revealed to the galaxy, because of how it will impact people's perception of her, as we see in the novel Bloodline. After coming across Vader's funeral pyre in the woods, she is reignited with hate for the man that took everything from her, and she refuses to be anything like him. But after she feels the guilt of knowing that she has the power but can't use it for good, and then after she finally taps into the Force to save her group, she feels the need for even more power and of the Force, leading her to agree to train with Luke. She has a very complex relationship with the Force and how it connects her to her father, but I think it adds even more meaning to why she decided to end her training. Both her and Han also have to deal with the fact that the Empire didn't completely disappear or give up after Palpatine's death, and that they still have a long road ahead of them before they can relax for good. This video is sponsored by Star Wars Vault, the newest place to buy all sorts of Star Wars merchandise online, ranging from articles of clothing, jewelry, and popular toys and collectibles. Follow the link in the description and use the code DECODED to earn 5% off of your purchase. Just like the LEGO Star Wars Summer Vacation Special, I was worried coming in that this was going to be one big advertisement for the Halcyon Starcruiser experience, and once again I was proven wrong. Having the honeymoon take place on the newly freed cruise as a publicity stunt to prove that the galaxy was indeed safe now that the Empire had been defeated made sense, and having it be part of the Chandrila Starline from Mon Mothma's homeworld helps add to the realistic nature of the story decision. We didn't learn as much about the Halcyon that I had expected, but the majority of what we got stuck for me, especially the details about the Halcyon's past. However, Leia's tour of the cruise for publicity never really interested me, and other than a few cool moments, it was mostly forgettable. When Leia and Han convince the crew of the Halcyon to change course, they end up taking a stop on the moon Maduris. It took a while for me to come around on the planet, but I really began to appreciate the culture of the new planet. The fact that the art was beautiful but finite in its existence was interesting and an intriguing concept to include in a marriage story, especially when we know Leia and Han's marriage begins to falter as Leia takes on a larger role in the New Republic government, and especially after their sons fall to the dark side. There were a lot of hints at an Imperial presence on the planet, and I really liked how the Chancellor of the Moon purposely slipped up, letting Han and Leia get small clues here and there, but it just felt like it took way too long to introduce the Empire. Part of it probably had to do with the fact that we already knew the Empire has a presence in the book because of the marketing, but not having a physical villain for the majority of the novel did impact some moments for me. Although Han and Leia having to deal with their own emotions rather than a physical enemy was much more enjoyable than I had expected. For the final group of chapters, I found myself glued to the book, unable to put it down. Even without a bunch of characterization, I had generally grown attached to these random fishermen on a remote moon, so when their lives and their planet were put in danger by the Empire, I found myself really caring about the outcome, which helped because I already knew Han and Leia were going to make it out fine. And the way everything was resolved left me utterly surprised, with it being something that was alluded to during most of the novel, but still something that I had never expected. Ever since the sequel trilogy wrapped up, I've been waiting to learn more about the 30-year gap between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. There were a few stories already told that I just hadn't gotten around to reading, like Bloodline and Aftermath, but so many more stories have been told recently that show us what Luke, Han, and Leia were up to. Even though it only takes place in a couple weeks following the Battle of Endor, the book does a great job of describing how parts of the galaxy changed when the Palpatine died, and how some stayed the same. Even though the Death Star has been destroyed, propaganda from Imperial remnants and a spread-out galaxy caused doubt to grow in some sectors that the Emperor had even been killed. Some people were so aligned with the Empire and how it allowed them to prosper that they refused to take the word from some rebels that the most powerful person in the galaxy was killed. Rumors circulated that the Emperor was on Coruscant at the time, where he still lived and ran the Empire. Something that I had noticed in the Shadow of the Sith novel, and even more in this novel when Han and Leia are on the Halcyon, is that regular citizens don't recognize how much the rebels gave up to bring down the Empire. They sacrificed relationships, money, time, their lives, and put themselves in harm's way on a daily basis, all to save the galaxy from oppression. They weren't supported by the general population like they should have been, and it was a very effective way in eliciting emotions from me and getting me to care even more about the rebels. The people aboard the Halcyon represented both sides of the war, and it helped humanize the conflict. Leia has to realize that not everyone in the Empire was as bad as the Emperor or Vader, and some were there just to survive and make a living. There was one specific character that I remember, who was the mother of an Imperial aboard the second Death Star. With the explosion of both Death Stars, many people, both in the real world and in universe, view it as a big victory for the rebels. Millions of people died in those explosions, and even though they might have partially deserved it for staying with the Empire, even after every atrocity they had committed, some just needed a way to survive and take care of their family. I enjoyed it, but I was also surprised at how deeply it resonated with me, because I was also one of those people who rarely thought about how many people had been killed aboard the Death Stars. Something that I never even thought of was how the landscape of the war changed after the Emperor died, and the rebels became a legitimate threat. Beforehand, the Empire couldn't do much without acknowledging that the Rebel Alliance was an actual threat, but with their leader gone and no need to maintain law and order, more assassinations and subterfuge would be used, including targets placed on rebel leaders like Leia. Even though she was used to the threats as a princess, Han, after recently marrying her, became very protective and cautious because of how public they were after Endor. For the most part, one of the best things this novel did was make connections to other Star Wars stories without making anything feel forced or in the reader's face. Other than one major connection that really started to annoy me, every time a familiar character or detail was mentioned, I found myself becoming overly excited. I try to keep the spoilers to a minimum when dealing with newly released Star Wars books, but in order to actually talk about a lot of these, I'm going to go in deep, so if you've watched this far and still haven't read the book, here's your first and final spoiler warning. I'll put a time code up somewhere on the screen if you want to skip the spoilers and go ahead to my next section of the review. It didn't come until near the end of the story, but it was easily my favorite reference in the book. I never would have expected it in 1,000 years, but I was completely shocked and in awe that Revis added this detail to the book. Near the end, when Green Squadron arrives to help deal with the escaping Imperial ship, it's Shara Bey leading the squad of A-Wings. Han takes a moment to question why Arvel Cryned isn't leading the ships, before remembering that he was killed during the Battle of Endor as he sacrificed himself to take down a Super Star Destroyer. For some reason, Cryned has always been one of my favorite background characters, even though it's just that one scene of him, so him being remembered and momentarily mourned by Han Solo in the scene was a huge win for me. I also mentioned Shara Bey, and both her and Kez Dameron, the parents of Poe Dameron from the sequel trilogy, make a few appearances throughout the book. Both characters' appearances made complete sense in the moment and never felt forced. It was a nice reference for those who know who the characters are, but it doesn't take anything away from the story if you're unfamiliar with them. Skipping around again, this time back to Han and Leia's wedding in a blink and you'll miss it moment. Following their ceremony where the entire rebellion is celebrating and dancing, Leia is helping the other rebels deal with their grief by going around and talking and dancing with them. In a quick mention, it's said that she was dancing with a rebel named Thane Kyrell, who is a major character in the Lost Stars novel. It's even mentioned how he's wearing the black armband that was also mentioned in the Lost Stars novel, which relates back to his native planet's culture. Lost Stars was the first Star Wars novel I ever remember reading, and it's personally still one of the best ones I've ever read. It's a great entry point to Star Wars books, but it's been seemingly forgotten about since then, despite the characters' story not being done. There's been talk among fans for a follow-up about Thane and Ciena Ree, the other main character, but nothing has been said yet from Lucasfilm. So just getting to see their one mention of Thane in the book shows that at least one of the authors is thinking about them. Because their wedding takes place on Endor, we get to see more of the Ewoks as a species, which I very much enjoyed. More of their culture is described, and although I haven't seen much of it, I'm pretty sure there was a connection to the old Ewok television series. Admiral Akbar mentioned the Drengir at some point, which were introduced in the High Republic, and for some reason, it just felt very forced for me. This was one of the few connections that I did have a problem with, even though this was a very minor one. I'm not quite sure why it didn't stick for me, but I think part of it has to do with because it's a newer addition to Star Wars canon, and other than the High Republic and other novels set before The Phantom Menace, I've never seen them mentioned before, so them being talked about this late in the timeline just felt weird for me. However, the main connection that I actually had a big problem with turned out to be the main Imperial villain, if you could even call her that. Alicia Beck was introduced to be the commanding Imperial officer on the moon that the Halcyon stopped at, and when she first meets face-to-face with Han and Leia, it's made very clear that Han and her have a history. I looked it up afterward, but apparently she appeared in the Smuggler Runs novel. However, after the characters meet, it immediately jumps into the action, and we never got to see how they know each other. For the rest of the novel, Han keeps mentioning Beck and how he knows what she thinks like. It's outright stated that the two characters know each other well, but we never get any sort of information as to what happened between them, and why Han knows that she won't give up searching for them, and why she wants to kill Han and Leia so badly. I'm sure it was fine for anyone who has read the Smuggler's Run novel before, but I really felt like I was missing out on key information, and it got to the point where I genuinely thought I had just zoned out for part of the story. If I ever read this novel again after reading Smuggler's Run, I doubt I'll have the same problem, but I assume that there's a lot of other fans out there like me that were very confused over the new Imperial villain for the conclusion of the story. Some other small references that I'll rattle off real quick. Leia mentions her droid Lola from Alderaan, which was introduced in the Kenobi series. Vader's deformed mask appeared, although it isn't stated who took it from the site of Vader's funeral. Galen Erso is mentioned during a game of sabacc by a creature who previously worked for the Empire, someone who also helped solve a flaw with the tractor beam that had allowed for Han and Chewbacca to previously escape the Empire using a nearby planet. A Lasat was also present during the game of sabacc, a species that didn't exactly have a good history with the Empire. The Nemoidian language Pakpak was mentioned by Leia. The event with Kira during the War of the Bounty Hunters comic was mentioned a few times by Leia. The Emperor's messengers were hinted at as being Palpatine's successors and giving orders even after his death. And finally, Han and Chewbacca's mission to free Kashyyyk from the Empire was mentioned at the start of the novel, which later ends up happening during the Aftermath novels. Before reading this book, I honestly didn't expect to be recommending this to anyone, especially when this year has seen the release of so many great Star Wars novels, with many more on the way this fall. However, this is absolutely worth taking the time to read, especially for any Han and Leia fans, which I think is about everyone. They're two characters that are arguably loved by everyone, and this story perfectly encapsulated the characters and their relationship. The overall story presented in the book is far from the most important galaxy-affecting story, but it adds more detail to what the galaxy is like immediately after the Battle of Endor and the death of the Emperor. The main selling point for this book, though, is the relationship between Han and Leia. Unless you're an avid comic reader, we never really got to see much of the two characters interacting other than in the original trilogy movies and The Force Awakens, which, considering the importance of Han and Leia, and what they have done for the galaxy isn't a lot. This book follows them immediately after Return of the Jedi ends, and we get to see their relationship blossom, from when they agreed to marry and then take on their first mission together despite being on their honeymoon. If the characters of Han and Leia interest you, I honestly can't recommend this book enough. If you're also a bit of a sucker for any sort of romance books or movies, then you'll probably enjoy this even more. Princess and the Scoundrel surpasses expectations and delivers a heartwarming marriage tale that develops already beloved characters while still adding a conflict that readers can care about, earning a rating of 9 out of 10. Let me know what your thoughts of Princess and the Scoundrel are in the comments below, or if you'll be picking it up after this. Remember to like the video, and subscribe for more in-depth reviews like this, as well as up-to-date news stories, Star Wars lore, gaming videos, and more. As always, thank you all for watching, and remember, the Force will be with you, always.